Hi, good morning, and welcome to the show Thinking Constellationally with Stephanie Sena. On this show, we connect the dots between systems of inequity and between ourselves and our neighbors. And I'm excited to have in the studio today one of my colleagues from Villanova University Center for Peace and Justice, Dr. Tim Horner. Tim, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me in.
So I wanted to bring in Tim. Tim and I, we have some of the same students at Villanova University. Students can major and minor in peace and justice, and so we have some of the same students who come to my class and they get excited about what they're learning in Dr. Horner's class, and they make a lot of connections between the issues of homelessness, poverty, and justice and equality that we discuss in class. And they're always saying, "Oh my gosh, I learned this from Dr. Horner's class." And it's these times when I wish that I was a student in his class. So I get to be a student in his class today. One of the reasons I love this radio show is because I get to sit in the student chair and have my guest be the teacher. So I'm excited to learn from you today, Tim, and talk to you about your area of specialty.
Well, I got to say, we're colleagues. So I am not, but in no way do I claim to be your teacher.
Well,
so
today you're going to be, because you're going to
yeah.
teach me and I think the listening audience a lot that we didn't already know. So
I appreciate that.
So yeah, I appreciate you being here, Tim.
Yeah.
So talk to me a little bit about what you teach, what your area of interest is, what your research is.
I think before I go into that, I want to position myself in all of this. Because it does have some bearing on what I do now. And
Perfect.
What I do now is very much a part of where I come from and who I am and and what my role is in this story, this unfolding story in this country. So I grew up in a small rural community in southwest Iowa in a place called Red Oak. 6,000 people, farming community. Grew up, my grandparents were farmers, grew up on my grandparents' farm with them, and had a very isolated, lovely, great when you're a kid, but also realized at a young age when I was like 15 that I had to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
There was a closed feeling to that. Without going into too much detail, MTV had something to do with that, and having cable and sort of seeing the world outside of that small community.
When is this, if you could?
This is I
50, know you're only about 20.
I'm 54, so this was all happening in the 70s and early 80s,
Okay.
In the 70s in particular. And then, so I'm white, I'm male, I'm cisgendered, in no way do I see myself as a target of oppression in this country. And in many ways, I am a product of a system that has told me over and over again in numerous ways, not just from my parents. My parents are these lovely people. That's not what I've come to realize, but the culture that raised me as this white male who is normative in every way, right? I'm not. I can't find any way in which I could claim some sort of oppressive status in this culture of America at this time. And so I was repeatedly told that I was the master race, that I was the gender that was dominant, that I was the color that was dominant, I was the sex that was dominant, I was able, I was smart enough to just be accelerated by the culture around me to put me in positions of power. And so that sort of growing, that much of what I do now is I went to seminary, I got a degree, I thought I was going to be a minister and a pastor, and then I got into graduate school and I started studying early Christian history. I had always been fascinated with the Holocaust and with the way that Christians thought about Jews. I never knew any Jews growing up, but I knew that Christians hated them somehow or thought they were dangerous somehow, and I was always very curious about that. Sometimes in a very unhealthy way when I was a teenager, a sort of a fascination about being what would have been the master race. But as I grew and started to look into this story more about where this came from, this sort of ancient fear or that's called the oldest hatred, and studying Christian history, I started stumbling into the back corners of the Christian story. I started stumbling into looking at the history of how this fear was created in historical sense. And that's, I think, when things started to come undone. It started to come undone for me, where I started to see that the forces that had put me in this position of power had another agenda for me. And it was causing me to see the world in very narrow ways. It was causing me to see the world through a very particular set of lenses that made me consider other people that didn't look like me, didn't act like me, didn't walk like me, didn't talk like me, as somehow lesser than me. And it created a distance. It created a distance between myself and seemingly the rest of the world, unless I stayed in white spaces.
Wow.
Unless I stayed in these places that were maintained, built, groomed, designed to keep me contained inside those spaces around other white people or other men or other cisgendered people or whatever people that I looked like.
Yeah. So so you started to be introduced to these ideas when you were in college, when you went into
Grad school.
Okay.
Mostly.
And where did you do undergrad and grad?
I went to a small Christian, like a evangelical Christian college.
Okay.
I went to an evangelical seminary. I grew up evangelical.
Oh, wow.
So I grew up with that sort of worldview.
When you went to college, were you still in Iowa, or did you leave Iowa?
No, I went to Chicago.
Okay.
And Chicago was a big part of that.
A little bit more diverse.
Yes.
That's what I'm curious about.
Yes.
And I'm also thinking about this, too, because of our student body, right?
Yes.
So because I do, like you, I feel like I started to be introduced to narratives and worldviews that ran counter to the ones that I was raised with when I was in college. Mm-hmm. And so I remember that feeling of, I tell my students when they come into my class that this space is both a space, the classroom space is a space of both safety and risk. Mm-hmm. And I say it's safe because we can feel free to explore ideas and be comfortable in that space to trust each other with our movement and our growth in terms of how we think. But it's risky because it is always a risk to be encountered with ideas that are different from the ones you were raised with, and to kind of start to question those worldviews that were normative in your youth, that were taught to you in your church or your synagogue or your mosque, or were taught to you by your parents and by the media. And that's a risky place to put yourselves in. For me, I always feel when my students come to me, they are faced with a lot of ideas that are so dramatically different to the ones they're raised with, and they start to think in new ways. And Thanksgiving is difficult because it's the mm-hmm. first time they go back home with these new ideas, and sometimes that creates a clash between themselves and their families when all of a sudden they're seeing the world differently. And
if they have my class in genocide, they're going home for Thanksgiving with not only that, but also a new understanding of what Thanksgiving is.
Yes.
Right? So we talk about the Pequot Massacre, we talk about colonialism, and so it's not only that they're coming back to their families and then coming back with these new ideas, but I also dare them to talk about what happened, why we have Thanksgiving in the first place.
So you and I are responsible for a lot of family arguments, is what I'm hearing, Tim.
That's right.
But so basically, though, and I bet that you, being in the position now of being a professor, remember that position of being a student and having that, and for some people, when they get these ideas that are counter to the ones that they're used to, it creates a cognitive dissonance, and they reject it because it is too difficult and painful to accept this new information that is so counter to what they've learned. But for other people, it's exciting. And I think for you and I, mm-hmm. we probably have that sense of excitement when all of a sudden our worldview is expanded and we see that, this things from a new lens, right? I would imagine you feel that way. Or you felt that way,
I do. And my college experience was different because I was in a very insular environment. So my college experience was basically about how do we reinforce the walls. How do we build up the defenses against the outside culture? How do we learn how to articulate the party line in a way that will make us feel safe and reassure us and soothe us and do all that kind of stuff.
So you didn't have any Professor Horners or Professor Senas?
No, quite the opposite.
Okay, got
quite
it.
the opposite.
Interesting.
So.
But you were in Chicago, so you were getting different ideas kind of from your environment anyway.
Most of the things that happened to me that really changed the way that I saw my place place and what was going on sort of in the background, the ambient narratives that are around us as white people didn't come until I was in graduate school, or even really, it wasn't until 9/11.
Oh, wow.
Frankly, it wasn't until
Interesting.
9/11 that really forced me or drew me into the study of how religion is used or utilized to not only justify but encourage violence on a grand scale.
Wow.
And it wasn't just about the rise of Al-Qaeda or that, but it was actually America's response to 9/11 in the way that religious ideology, religious patriotism, this idea of vengeance, this idea that rose up amongst us in our midst and put us into Iraq in 2003. And I think my response coming back from studying in England, I was at Oxford for 6 years doing my graduate work, and coming back to America, I had this feeling of return. I had this nostalgia. I was very excited to be back in America. I put out an American flag on my front porch when I first moved back, and I was just happy to be back. I'd been away, but I wanted my kids to be raised and have American education and all that stuff. And then 9/11 hit, like 3 months into my first tenure as teaching. And what happened in the wake of that, and the way that we became a nation dead set on vengeance, and that way that unfocused us, the way that unhinged us as a country. There was that brief moment of solidarity, right, in the months that followed, and we all came together, and we all remember that, sort of. But right next to that...
We remember that, but maybe and our students, I don't think, remember
no,
that.
No
which is
longer.
weird.
They no longer remember that. But what it did mostly was it unhinged us, and we became a country set on vengeance. And that response to violence, our response to violence, really made me start thinking about how masses of people... find themselves in places where they are on board with creating or with undoing people or making people disappear. I think one of the things that I've come to and this led me ultimately to go to Rwanda in 2007, which then completely rocked my world and changed me from really teaching and studying early Christianity in the 2nd and 3rd century to studying not exclusively, because I still do some things in that area, but I teach classes on genocide and atrocity and violence in the more general way. And it made my background sort of oddly equipped me for the study of institutional violence. Because the story of anti-Judaism within Christianity is the story of institutional violence against Jews, which culminated in the Holocaust. Right. But there are other ways in which that happens on a national level. And so that curiosity of finding out about where violence comes from, where genocide, that very particular form of violence comes from, and what sort of brought me into this more full realization of what role colonialism had in this, what role we are now in our history, about why the 20th century was so bloody with a very particular type of killing that took place in this century that was different from previous centuries, and why that sort of all has come together to be this moment of time.
So, so you and I did a TED Talk together in 2015, and I think I'll put up the links on when I'm sharing the link for our podcast. But it was a great TED Talk, and you had done one prior, maybe a couple years prior to the one we did together, which was fascinating, and I've actually showed it in my class many times because I think that the gist, correct me if I'm wrong, was that that genocide, we think it's based on hate, but in fact it's based on love. And you said something in the TED Talk which really stuck with me is that when we think of genocide, we often think about man's inhumanity, but you said that there's nothing we can do that is actually inhumane. Like everything is in the realm of what humans can do, and so then we have to start to understand it, and that it comes from a place of potentially brotherhood, sisterhood, love, solidarity. For me, so I've taught also about the Nazi genocide and the genocide of the Jews, and I have seen Nazi propaganda posters with pictures of Nazis underneath it. It says community, love, brotherhood, caring for the poor. This is what the Nazis stood for. And I've also read the minutes of Nazis getting together in like beer halls and having their meetings. And in the minutes, I guess I was raised because I was raised Jewish. And I think right out of the womb, I was born August 28th, 1979. And at, I think, 12:03 p.m. and at 12:04 p.m., they said, let's tell you about the Holocaust. Like, I think that I was raised with this, and not only with the idea of the Holocaust, but I was raised with the narrative that it was because the Jews were hated. And I was raised with the narrative that the Germans were somehow inhumane, and that we must stick together as Jews and protect each other so that will never happen again. And I have to say that that idea is still predominant. I think I recently went to Germany. I have family. My uncle married a woman who's German, and I went and visited her family. And when I told some of the older generation of Jews in my family that I was going to Germany, they were shocked. How could you go there after what they did? And when I went to Germany, I realized Berlin has the most flourishing Jewish population, I think, of any city in Europe right now. And there's beautiful synagogues and, really flourishing Jewish culture today. But in Judaism in the United States, it's still this idea that what they did was so inhumane. And for me, because of that teaching, I couldn't understand, number one, what happened, and I couldn't understand how it could happen again or how it could happen here. And then furthermore, too, I believe that whole narrative that Jews in the United States are taught from birth, really, that this happened to us, we must band together so that it never happens again, and it was based on other people hating us. That belief has led us to do incredible atrocities to the Palestinians, in my view. And I advocate for Palestinians and for a free Palestine. And I've had Jews come up to me and say to me, how could you do that? They hate us. And they hearken back to the Holocaust, that, they want a genocide, they want to kill us all. So I think that idea that we have to stop the Palestinians before they kill us, in essence, it's rooted in love. I hear that because it's this idea that we need to have connection to each other, and we are similar to each other as Jews. We have something in common, and that commonality creates a bond. And our love of each other in this bond is so strong that we will do anything to protect it, including violence. So it's fascinating to me how that all goes around.
It's the one thing that is sort of common and maybe surprising in the study of genocide is the way that all genocides, and maybe this is true, but I think this is all true about violence too in general, but especially seen in genocide, and it's counterintuitive in a way, because people see genocide as just this expression of monstrous violence, inhumane violence against other helpless victims, right? So there's this idea that it's just hate. Yeah. It's just hate, when in fact, time and time again, if you look at the ideology of all genocidal regimes,
it's okay. We have
you'll find, and maybe we can pick this up
Sure.
after the break, is this idea that underneath all of these narratives of violence is self-victimization.
Absolutely. I see
and
that.
So, and that self-victimization is something that we can come back to, because I think it's really an undercurrent and brings back and connects some of those dots about where we see ourselves now in this country and the way and the role of self-victimization, especially in our white students.
Yeah, amazing. So important. I'm excited to pick up on that as soon as we get back, but we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be right back with Dr. Tim Horner talking about issues of genocide and also love and forgiveness. So be right back.
Being prepared is a part of who you are, but it's especially important in the case of a disaster. Be informed about possible emergencies in your area. Make a plan that covers where you go in an emergency. Build a kit with the things you need to survive. There's no one more capable of planning for your situation than you.
Start your plan today. Go to ready.gov/myplan.
They call me Maxie, but I prefer tripod. I was your above-average four-legged homie, and then wham-bam minivan. Some people pity me. Now that's lame. I still run, fetch, and swim. And the ladies love me. I'm the ultimate wingman. Just don't ask me to high five.
Okay, and we're back. Good morning again. This is Stephanie Sena on the show Thinking Constellationally by USALA Media. And I'm here with my guest, Dr. Tim Horner. Tim Horner is a colleague of mine at Villanova University's Center for Peace and Justice, and he's here to talk about some of his research on genocide and systems of inequity, love, and also forgiveness. So, Tim, if we could pick back up from where we just dropped off.
Yeah, I think this is what is one of the things that came through my study of genocide that I did not see coming. I think when I originally started thinking about it, I thought of it as a curiosity of human nature, right? About why people do this. And I think this is a common thing. This is why this class is popular with people, is because it's a common question. It's not as fringe as you think, right? Why do genocides happen? Why do people do these things to each other? And what's behind it? And I think one of the things that I came to understand, which was a bit of a revelation to me, was that idea of the role of fear. And the reason we fear, or the reason we fight the things we fight, is because we fear them. And we fear them because we fear that they might do something to damage us or the people that we call our group. And I think this is one of the big things that sort of loops back onto where we find ourselves now, and what are those factors that play into genocide? And what I found is that they're common everyday things. We think genocide comes from this sort of very unusual place in our dark human psyche, this sort of reptile part of our brain that it springs up, and if we don't keep control over it, it will just arise and erupt and just wipe out everybody. It's this mindless kind of violence. When in fact, genocide is made from common household products right around the house, the things that we are familiar with in everyday life. And one of those things is love. And that's actually if we didn't love or care for people around us, it wouldn't bother us. Genocide would not bother us. It would just be something that happened. But it does. It bothers us deeply. It offends us. There's something, and that's what's so scary about it, is because it threatens the very thing that we love so much, which is each other. So then the question becomes is who? Well, that was the title of the TED Talk, is who would you kill for? Who are the people? How do you negotiate those lines of allegiance in not only as a culture, and as a nation, which is what we're kind of doing right now, where those lines of allegiance about who calls themselves American, who is really American, is all part of these concentric circles that fan out from ourselves, and are these places that no one has a problem with the idea of, if someone broke into your home and tried to kill you and your family, what would you do? And if people respond in like manner, they can understand people who use violence for self-defense, or they can understand that they might even do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do if they were under those circumstances. But then when you start fanning those circles out, you start to get people to start thinking, and this is what I do with students, and this kind of becomes a part of the process of learning about genocide, is where do your circles stop? And how do you define those circles of the people that you call us? Pronouns are really important to me. They're becoming incredibly important. They're the smallest part of our language, and yet they contain the most information about, and how we use them contains incredible amount of information about who we are and who we think we are, and who our clan is, who our tribe is, who are the people that we would kill for. And those circles become fuzzy as we go out, or they become apparent to my students of who's okay to kill and who's not okay to kill. Right? And under what circumstances. And in that respect, when you start studying genocide, you start studying the lines of allegiance that certain groups had that defined them as a group worth killing for. one of the legacies of the Nazis, and I didn't notice this until I had been teaching this class for several years, and I caught myself in class talking about, especially with the Holocaust, is I talked about the Germans on one hand and the Jews on the other. So the Germans hated the Jews, or the Germans feared the Jews, or the Germans like all this stuff. And I realized
German Jews.
I had fallen into this is the legacy of the Nazis, was to convince us that there were two groups of people in Germany.
Yeah.
There were Germans and Jews.
Yeah.
But there weren't.
Yeah.
There were German Jews
Amazing.
and German Christians.
I say the same thing. We hear about the Palestinian-Arab conflict, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and don't even recognize that there are Palestinian Israelis and there's
That's right.
Arab Israelis and there
right.
are Arab Jews who are Israelis, and that these things are significantly more complicated. But the language is so important,
So important.
and is often used to divide.
Yes,
Absolutely,
this is the way in which I think this is where we can get into when my students start to realize that they have these concentric circles in their own lives, and that they're not even aware of these outer realms about who they care for and who they don't, or even why they care for one group and why not another. That's the bigger question. Why do we have these concentric circles, or why do we do this? And this is where things get a little more dicey because I also study colonization, and sort of the mindset of colonization is still very much with us. In respect to my students, our students at Villanova are predominantly white. What happens at Villanova is not representative. Our demographics are not representative of America, right? I know that we are trying to do things at that university, at our university. We're trying to move in that direction. There are some successes and there are some frustrations that just don't seem to move. But it's not a representative. So we find ourselves with a lot of white students who grew up very nice families, very nice people, very thoughtful, want to do the right thing, moralistic, and that kind of thing. And yet they are participating in some ways. They are the recipients of that colonial mindset, that there are some people that are more important than other people, and that the grounds by which you determine who is more important than another people is not something that is arbitrary or absolute or even part of human nature. It is actually a legacy of a system of preference that can be traced historically to parts in our history in the West about where we got these ideas. And some of them are more distinct, like ideas of race. You can point to, and I do this in my class on genocide, where we talk about North American genocide. We talk about the Rwandan genocide. We talk about the Herero and the Nam in South Africa, or Namibia in 1904. We talk about Armenia.
Do you talk about Cambodian genocide?
Sometimes. But what we see in all of those things is we see a legacy of race, especially in Rwanda, that legacy of the idea of race as an absolute immovable structure that you cannot escape from. Once you are labeled a race, you cannot move from that. That is different. That is a legacy. That is something very particular to colonialization. It is very particular to the West. It is not something that is that you can look to other cultures around the planet at different parts in history and see this. Tribalism is different. My people are different. My religion is different. You see that in ancient history. But the idea that race as a construct that is scientific and immovable. Once you are Jew, you are always Jew. Once you are black, you are always black. Once you are white, you are always white. Or once you are native or indigenous, you're always that. That is a very particular thing that we still carry with us.
And anti-Semitism wasn't always based on this.
No,
right?
it was not.
Originally, I believe that Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation, was anti-Semitic. But his anti-Semitism, I believe, was based on religion and the idea that you could convert out of that.
Yeah.
But when it switched to being anti-Semitism switched to being a racism, which I think, but I could be wrong, maybe started in the 1800s.
A little bit earlier in some ways, but popular, into the popular imagination.
Well,
it actually coincided with in the Industrial Revolution. It coincided with Europeans, and I put this in air quotes, discovering Africa. And so the idea of finding and the amount of movement of peoples around the planet when you have an increase of movement, and especially in this country when you have chattel slavery,
Yeah.
when you have the enslavement of Africans and bringing them into this country, and the presence of these people who look so markedly different from
Right.
Europeans, right, in these sort of visual ways, that we, and I say we because I am included in this legacy, we had to come up with a narrative that explained why we were doing the things we were doing. And so the ideas of race fit very well and sort of accelerated this idea of it, created a narrative that explained why we were doing the things that we were doing to this particular group of people and why it was justified. Not just justified morally, but justified in a religious sense too. And so you have this wedding of this sort of match between the sort of the practical economic implications of using free labor in this country from Africa, married to this religious idea that was developed because of that. This idea that these races are divinely formed, that one of these groups is going to be by divine law enslaved to the others, and that this is not only okay, but it's divinely sanctioned. These all kind of came together at the same moment in time to help explain, and I want to be clear about this, after the fact, that first came slavery and then came the justification
That's
of it.
fascinating.
Not the other way around.
The other thing I find interesting is like, okay, so in the 1800s we have like the Austrian composer Wagner, who is very anti-Semitic, and he's making all these statements and writings about Jews and their race. So I remember learning that as a child, but one thing I didn't realize until much later is that, you know, I believed, okay, so I first of all believed that Judaism was not a race, or at least I grew up to believe that Judaism is not a race, and the idea that it was a race was used against the Jews. What I didn't realize until later is that the Jews themselves, in many ways in the 1800s, were using this argument that Judaism was a race, not to say we are an inferior race, but to say that we are a separate race. So, for example, Theodor Herzl, who is the father of modern Zionism, now he was married to a Christian. He wasn't a practicing Jew at all. But in his writings, to say that the Jews needed a state, it was all race-based. It was that the Jews need a state because they are different because of their race. And as a distinct and different race, we need our own state to protect us. That was mind-blowing for me, because it was this idea that the Jews had adopted this theory that they were a separate race, and based on that idea, then believed they needed a separate place.
Yeah.
So fascinating.
Judaism is the one kind of exception to this rule, because it even the idea that Jews were different from Christians goes back 1,000 years, right? We have sources even from the medieval period that Jews somehow smelled different than other people. They were not prone to disease in the same way that Christians were. They had different motivations. They wanted to kill Christian babies and to devour them. They were immune to the plague. They brought the plague. I mean, there are these old medieval ideas that had them. These are a different kind of. They're different from us in these elemental ways, but they didn't have the scientific constructs of race that came later that you could access to sort of solidify or concretize.
Fit to that race box, but before that they were still trying to find some kind of justification, which was more than about religion, but these people are somehow fundamentally different than us.
And this was
humans.
a terribly ambiguous thing within Christianity. Don't think for a minute that I'm saying that all Christians believe this.
Of course.
This was accessed and used for very different reasons by Christians during particular points of stress. And this is a very interesting one that I teach in my genocide course, is that the idea of the blood libel, which is the blood libel is a very ancient claim that Jews still want to continue to kill Christ, and so they still seek to kill Christians or Christian babies, and then crucify them, drink their blood, eat their flesh, that kind of stuff.
That's just my normal breakfast, is that not?
That's right.
Is that not a thing that
there are plenty
do?
of woodcuts that you get this. But those blood libels arose at a very particular time in Christian history. They didn't just arise out of nowhere. They arose at a time where other Christians were having really serious doubts about what was happening in the Eucharist. Christians were wondering, is it really the body of Christ? Is that really the blood of Christ in there? It doesn't seem like that. And so you have this sort of growth in this scholasticism that's saying, like, doubting whether or not it's really the body and blood. And right alongside that, you have the rise of these myths about Jews want to kill Christ. So it has this function where it is actually there to convince Christians that the Jews know that the Eucharist is real. The Jews, who are the enemies of Christianity, they even know that the Eucharist is the true body and blood of Christ, because they still want to go and steal the host and kill it and stab it, because they know it's the body of Christ.
Wow.
It's a rhetorical tool. It's a piece of propaganda to teach Christians not to doubt that what is happening in the Eucharist.
Yeah.
And so Jews have always been used by Christians and in Christianity as a rhetorical tool to sort of shame Christians that vary outside the realms of heterodoxy. And throughout Christian history, you see that whenever Christians step outside of the heterodox orthodoxy of the church, they are universally called Jews. They are universally condemned as being, oh, well, you're being a Jew. Oh, you're Jewish.
Yeah.
And that trope for Christianity is something quite different from anything else, any other existing groups that we have within the West. That's why Judaism is slightly different from.
Okay.
That's why you have this puzzle. How can Jews be a race? And yet Nazis thought they were a race, but Christians thought they were a race too. As soon as they got the language of science to apply to them, they applied it to them.
And then, but another thing you said that I find fascinating is you said that at certain times of stress, this became even more.
Yes.
And for me, I see that, especially I think in times of like economic stress. I think, and here's the scapegoat. You know that I feel, and this isn't. We can say this about Jews, but also about so many other groups as well.
Absolutely.
That in times of stress, and certainly economic stress is a main one. But I think we're looking for someone to blame, someone to pin that on. I've absolutely seen this during the time of the Nazis coming to power, and Germany was having extreme economic crisis, and saying that the problem was the bankers, right? And in many ways, yes, except that for many reasons, the Jews were predominantly bankers. I believe because they were kept out of many of the trades, and so they were pushed into this area of banking. And then banking, I believe, by and large, creates a lot of systems of corruption and complication because of our capitalist system. But so today we have these bankers who are awful, but there are a variety of different religions. If they were just, for example, Hindus, I say this to my students, and we didn't have everyday interactions with Hindus and didn't know much about them, but only knew them related to banking.
Yeah.
I think that we would maybe be in the same position today to pin our anger towards bankers on this one religion.
Right. And this is one of the most effective tools. Like, this is not just particular to Christianity. This is a phenomenon that one of the most powerful tools that people use to control other people is fear. Yes. Right? So insofar as whoever controls the message can use these tropes, and whether it's Jews, or whether it's immigrants, or whether it's black people, or whether it's liberals, or whether it's conservatives, like, it doesn't really even matter. It is a great way to harness allegiance when you can convince people that another group is threatening your lifestyle or your existence or your people. Then you can get a tremendous amount of energy, and you can get people to do things that they would never ordinarily do. And so that's one of the things that I think is one of the takeaways, is trying to get my students to see that these things are part of the toolkit that we have as human beings, and there are vulnerable points in that, and they have to do with really some of the most revered parts of our nature. Are actually vulnerable to being abused and manipulated by people. And if we're not aware of that, then we leave ourselves vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think absolutely awareness is the inoculation. And I want to pick up on this when we come back from our break, is how fear is being used, especially today in our country, because I think we are a very fearful nation, and we need to be careful because that fear can lead to violence, and I already see that it is. And talk about how we can inoculate ourselves against that. So I'm excited to come back and talk about that with our guest, Tim Horner. We'll be right back. Thank you. Awesome.
not completing high school is more of a social thing than it was an academic thing. Even though all these years have passed, I still had that longing to have my diploma. I have a mentor, and she convinced me to continue my education. No one receives a diploma alone. If you're even considering getting your high school diploma, go get it. You can do it.
Find free adult education classes near you at finishyourdiploma.org.
What do you think you're doing, Kevin?
Was just gonna drive home.
There are several warning signs present that you shouldn't be driving.
Like hearing voices?
Like your text-to-emoji ratio?
Oh man, the selfies.
Selfie. Nailed it.
We all have warning signs that let us know that we're probably not okay to drive. Mine is pretending to be your subconscious.
Greg, come on man, let's split a ride home.
Okay, thanks. And we're back with on Thinking Constellationally with my guest and colleague, Dr. Tim Horner, who's talking to us about genocide, fear, love, forgiveness. When you were talking, Tim, I was reminded of one of my favorite Radiolab episodes called The War of the Worlds. Mm-hmm. And they talked about that so Orson Welles, right, wrote War of the Worlds. Have you read it?
No, I've heard but I heard that podcast.
That podcast?
And,
Okay,
and I
love
know
it.
I know the radio show, and
yeah, I've actually played the podcast before, so I can't remember exactly when the radio show was, but to give context, the show that the Radiolab podcast was based off of, I think, was happening right around the late 1930s, early 1940s, something in there. Mm-hmm. And so, and this 1930s, 1940s radio show was both based on Orson Welles' book, War of the Worlds. But in essence, what happened is that in this time in the United States, radios were incredibly prevalent, and people were tuning in and listening to news. But the way that they consumed news in the during World War II was dramatically different than the way that they had consumed news before. And so because so much was happening in that war, and it was being broadcast over sound waves, and people would get on their couches, turn on the radio, and be transported. Mm-hmm. And there would be an anchor who would be telling the story about what was happening. You know, there's another bombing that happened in Dresden, and mm-hmm. people would tune in to listen, and they would get sucked in, and they would feel this fear because it seemed like the world was ending, and they never knew what was going to happen next, with bombing everywhere and people dying. And, you know, and there was so much happening that was scary, but they tuned in, and the anchor was they called it an anchor. It was this person who anchored the listeners, and kind of, it was this way of, they were being scared and then lulled at the same time into believing everything was going to be okay as long as the anchor was still there. Mm-hmm. So Orson Welles, seeing how people were consuming the news without thinking critically about it and without questioning the narratives that they were getting, he, this story of War of the Worlds, I think, was tricking listeners into believing that we were actually at the end of the world. Mm-hmm. So this radio cast was basically these broadcasters were saying we had an alien invasion, mm-hmm. and you have to hurry up and leave the house and run because the aliens are going to take over. Mm-hmm. And it's so ludicrous to think that aliens have invaded our world and we are potentially going to be all killed by them. However, in the context of people thinking they could never imagine that what was happening in this war was going to happen, and yet here it was, that really it was not that much of a leap. And as long as the broadcaster said it was so, they weren't going to question it. And that people actually were frightened that this was the truth. Right. And this had been tested over and over again in audiences, the broadcaster saying we've had an alien invasion, and over again the audience has been tricked. And today we see it too, that when we tune into the news, often we consume it, mass consume it in a way that leads us to turn off our critical thinking skill.
Right. And that idea of the fear narrative and the power that which we were talking about in the last segment is interesting in that in some ways it's easy to scare people. right? Because that fear of invasion is around it, and that's very easy. That to me is our most elemental human fear, is the fear of invasion. And invasion can take many forms. It can be a physical invasion, spiritual invasion, a psychological invasion, a geographical invasion. Rape is invasion, killing is invasion, possession is invasion, immigration is invasion, neighborhoods are invasion, redlining is invasion.
I'm thinking of NIMBYism. I'm thinking of the rape trials of black men, like this fear
invasion
that's,
is
and
the one
that
thing
ourselves, or we are going to be disrupted in
Right.
who we are and where we are.
and the amount to which we extend our bodies to the people around us,
Wow.
quite literally, is that point of invasion.
Wow.
So we're not so troubled if Yemen is being invaded. But if we think that someone might be moving, like if we think that people are coming into our country, that sense of ourself,
or our neighborhoods,
if it's nationally based, would feel as if we're invaded. But that's actually not the biggest enemy, I don't think. Here's the thing that the invasion does, is it forces students and me, and I sense this in myself too, but I've become aware of it and I'm very skeptical of it, is what that does is when you feel you're invaded, it pushes you into comfort narratives. It pushes you to seek out comfort. Because comfort is what we want and security is what we want more than anything, right? Because that makes sense. The thing that scares us the most is invasion. Therefore, the thing that comforts us the most is the sense of security, the sense of stability that regardless of how we define that, right? I don't care who you are, you have some sense or some understanding of what makes you feel safe and secure. And if there's a threat to that makes you feel frightened. And when you are in that state, you seek out comfort. And this is also the irony of genocides and atrocity or mass incarceration, right? Or redlining or anything. It's the promise of a utopia that is at the end of that. That is the ultimate comfort narrative. And that, I think, is the biggest thing that I fear in our students and my students, is that these fear narratives, which are everywhere around us, they actually force us to look for comfort narratives to replace them. And those comfort narratives for our white students are, I just need to make sure I end up in a good neighborhood, that I have good schools for my kids, that I have a good job, and that I really form around me a kind of enclave of comfort so that I can function. And that does not mean that you can be a left-wing liberal and want that same kind of comfort, right? So that I don't care what your politics are. What my great worry about our students is that and this is the kind of constellational thinking, is that the fear narratives, the invasion narratives that are all around us force us to reduce our constellation, to make it smaller, so that we can control those constellations and make sure we can maintain those comfort narratives. This is why it frightens my students so much to look at the North American genocide, is because they're confronted with the fact that where are our heroes? Where are our ancestors? In study chattel slavery, and you look at Jefferson and Washington and all these other people, like, who are our ancestors now? So where is our constellation? And if we oppose slavery or oppose this, how do we now navigate this new reality when we no longer can count on those comfortable people that we call our founders, or the comfortable ideas that America is this great country based and built on this? And when you undermine that, that fear, you're invading their narrative. And so that invasion it threatens to reduce them. That's why I try to build up in my students this idea called capacity or capaciousness. Like what you have to learn how to do to live in the modern world is learn how to have capacity to hold conflicting narratives about the world, about your identity, without having to choose one or the other. Because that choice will make you compromise and it's basically that choice is you're running away from fear. So you can have liberals that run away from conservatives and just hang out with other liberals, or conservatives reject all their limits, hang around with the conservatives. What we're doing in that moment is we're trying to seek security. And in this world now, and I think our students are at a particular moment in our human history, they are overwhelmed with forces that we've never encountered as a human species before. Agreed. And so much information is coming in that we have no equipment. We have nothing developed. I think we have equipment, but we don't have a protocol for dealing with this. And so it's so tempting for my students to collapse into those comfort zones. And they have nothing to do with politics. They have to do with comfort. So I'm trying to build in my students of this capacity to be uncomfortable, the capacity to stay with these narratives, even though they're conflicting, and a kind of a wait and see what emerges from a community of people that have the capacity to hold these alternate narratives together at the same time. And that act of holding these things in tension together with other people will create a new narrative.
I love that. It's why I say that when I started by saying like my class and so is yours is a place of safety and risk, and the risk is being willing to accept discomfort and sitting in that instead of immediately searching for what is going to ease this suffering that I have right now. Now that I'm being encountering these ideas that are new to me and get me to reconsider who I am and who my identity is.
And it's a little jarring for students to see that what they do in this sort of small way is precisely what the Nazis did.
Yeah.
It's precisely what the Hutu did in Rwanda. Precisely what happened with the Herero and the Lebensraum, the idea, or like these things are again part of our. It's part of what it means to be human. They're household products. There's not a genocide gene in us. Yeah. There's all these other common products that when you put them together in this sort of perfect storm, you can have this moment where people are doing things that they would never otherwise do. Because they feel threatened in that moment. And there's nothing wrong with seeking security. There's nothing wrong with that in and of itself, but it's a price. There's a cost. There's always a cost.
Yeah.
So for white people to seek security, my question to them is, what is the cost of that security? What does that cost when you choose to be in a great school district and you are willing to pay more to make sure that your kids are in a, quote, good school? What's the cost of that? What is the cost of just hanging around with other liberals? And mostly the people that take our classes are liberal,
That's right?
Let's be honest about that. We're not. So I'm thinking like it'd be easy for us to just preach to the choir and sort of self-reinforce and create an echo chamber where the problem is in those Nazis or those conservatives or whatever. That's actually not the enemy. The enemy is that enclave.
That's right. And I think that we constantly need to be self-reflective on this.
Yes.
And I believe that I'm part of this too. So I tell my students that I actually do live in a bubble. Now, interestingly, I think when we think as a nation about the bubble, we're kind of aware that we live in a bubble in terms of our groups tend to be not very diverse. And my group and my bubble is diverse in almost every single way. They're diverse absolutely in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of race, religion, all of those major categories. One way that they're not diverse really is in terms of worldview, and part of that is because, so like you, I teach in the Center for Peace and Justice. My students, many of them are peace and justice majors. My colleagues are progressive-minded, liberal, peace and justice professors and advocates. And so when I go to college, and I used to teach at Villanova in the history department, and I would teach gen eds to business majors. And it was very difficult for me to convince them to care about other people, right? And so in my class now is an elective.
But they, let me say, they do care about other people.
Yes,
but they
that's right.
care
That's
about
right.
different
That's
people
right.
than you.
You're right, and thank you for pointing that out. That's incredibly important. Yes. And so for me to teach history of homelessness and poverty, so where I am right now in the Center for Peace and Justice, my class is an elective, and students have hundreds of electives to choose from, and they choose Center for Peace and Justice, and in that selection then, I only have a certain type of student in my class, and so they come on day one, and I ask them, what are you wondering? And on day one, and they say, I want to know how to end poverty and homelessness, right? And so I'm only getting a very small subsection of Villanova. And then in addition to that, I run a homeless shelter, and my entire world is either spent with people who are experiencing homelessness or people who want to help end it, right? And so I feel like I also live in the city in a which is cities by nature tend to be a little bit more liberal and progressive than other areas, but certainly Philadelphia is very progressive, and the area I live in is wealthy and progressive. And so I'm not often exposed to, and I listen to NPR and Washington Post and The Atlantic, and I'm not exposed to a lot of different viewpoints. And when I do, I do get uncomfortable. And so, and I do feel like I have an echo chamber that I live in. And in some ways I recognize that, and I feel for me, the way I've justified that is that it protects my energy, and that when I hear things that run counter to that worldview, it hurts my heart. When I hear racism and I hear anti-classism, that those ideas to me hurt my energy, and I need to protect it.
Yeah, that's a balance that you, as you grow older, the deeper
Yeah.
into this, that you have to sort of learn to balance that. I think with young students, I went through that when I first started sort of coming into this new awareness of my place and how I was the beneficiary of all this colonialism, and how I couldn't escape it. Like, as much as I wanted to escape my privilege, I could not.
Yeah.
And that reality is an uncomfortable thing that I still cope with every day. And I remember thinking, I got to get out of this place. I got to get out of Villanova because I'm just surrounded by white people.
Yeah.
Like, I've got to get out of this place of privilege. I've got to get away from all this shininess. I need to get to a place where I can be in a diverse environment. And you know what I've realized now over the years is that would be a cop-out. That I am actually in the very place that I need to be. I am white, and I am in a white space. And there are people that do not have access to this white space that I'm in because I'm here.
Yes, I
Right? And so
agree.
because I have been
Myself
propelled
also.
into this space because of my whiteness, for me to run away from this white space and sort of get away and it would be a soothing thing that would affirm me that I'm not like one of those bad white shiny people.
Yeah.
Instead, what I've seen is this is my mission field.
Okay,
Like,
interesting.
I have access. I can say things in white groups
Yes,
that
agreed.
people of color would never be able to say, or if they said it, they would be discounted out of hand.
100%.
So for me, I'm an insider to whiteness in every possible way. So I'm trying to learn how to exploit my privilege
Yep, I love that.
to bring about a thing that I don't have to read about in a book.
Yeah.
That I feel has been woven into me as a person. So no one's going to bullshit me about what great capitalism is
Yeah.
and sort of the invisible hand of the law, kind of a libertarian kind of
Yeah.
idea that's very popular in places like this, because I know what that game is. I didn't read that in a book. I didn't read that because I'm not the recipient of it. I know that because I am the recipient of it. So I know the game, so I can call things out, and I can smell, I can see it because I feel it, because it's inside of me. And I used to hate that. I used to feel like I was trapped inside this white, straight male body. But now I realize that that's actually my greatest asset, because I'm like it's like a canary in a coal mine.
yeah.
It's like what Plato said is that gadfly in him that sort of is his conscience. I have this whiteness in me, and it gives me access to whiteness that other people don't
And you're going
have.
to use that.
And I'm going to use that to try to move people, move other white students in particular there, which is why I take a story, if I have just time for this quick story that really was influential. This is from Malcolm X, the autobiography of Malcolm X. And there's this story about this white advocate, this white woman who comes up to him early on in his career, and she's like, yeah, this is terrible. What we're doing, I'm a white person, I want to help, just tell me how I can help you, do whatever I can. And initially he said, no, I don't want your help. I don't need your help, get lost, and just shrugged her off. And she was crestfallen and heartbroken. And he was just like, I don't need a handout from white people. I totally understand where that comes from. But then later in his life, he thought back on it, and he regretted what he said to her, because he said, what I need you to do is to go back to your white friends and tell them what you know. And testify to your white friends in your white spaces what you see.
Yeah.
And I remember when I read that, it was about, I don't know, I'd read it probably 6 years ago. Like, I'm kind of embarrassed to say that it was just 6 years ago, but that really hit home. That turned me like, I am that white woman. I have to go back to my white spaces and tell them what I know, right? Because that's, my journey is not extraordinary. There's nothing extraordinary about it. I didn't have it just is, I just kept being curious and kept trying to figure out what was going on and why things happened. That allows me to speak to other white students in a way that other people don't have access to.
And I think we can model for our students how to be curious, how to be uncomfortable, how to think critically, and how to ask good questions. And I think that in the remaining few seconds we have left, I think that we all need to do that, especially in this world, to fight against fear and to fight against that need for comfort that could potentially lead to us doing, acts of violence to others. I think that we should understand the context of how this has happened and how it could easily happen to us because, as you said, the ingredients for genocide, for creating violence, are all within ourselves. They're household products. And if we understand that, we realize that there's no human act that is actually inhumane. We can all do that, but the way not to do that is to be self-aware, inoculate ourselves from that fear, be willing to be uncomfortable, be willing to stand with others, and start to recognize our role and question our own identity. So I think these are really great tactics. I'm so grateful to have you in the studio today, Tim, and I love being your colleague and your office neighbor and listening to you. I could listen to you for hours, so we'll have to have you back. But Tim, thank you so much for talking to us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. And thank you to our audience, and we'll see you back next week on Thinking Constellationally. Take care.